Today, psychotropic drugs are recklessly oversubscribed and overused. How does overuse of psychotropic drugs negatively impact the collective health of this country?
That's a very important question because psychiatry is not really a hard science like infectious disease. Infectious disease, we know there are bugs, we know what they do and how they're transmitted for the most part. With psychiatric disease, we don't really know what causes most of psychiatric disease. Much of it, there's something biochemical going on with people who have serious mental illness. But there's also a cultural, social, family context as well. And in my opinion, what we're doing is because there's so much money to be made with the psychotropic drugs and claims about newer drugs are better, which often are not true, that we ignore the larger context in which the person's mental health symptoms are being expressed and just turn it into a pill. And that's destructive. It's destructive, very destructive for the patient. Sometimes people need a pill. Sometimes they're hearing voices. They're having uncontrollable mood swings. They're having a risk of becoming violent. There are real mental health problems. This is not to be denied. But to turn this into a for-profit venture means that we're going to lean too much on the medicines. And I got into some litigation about the newer antipsychotic drugs. And what I found is that often, not only were the articles that were peer-reviewed, the peer reviewers didn't have the data, but often the experts who went around to educate the health leaders in the medical communities, so the higher-ups educating the slightly lower-ups who are still higher up to most docs, they didn't have access to the data. And they often were developing giving their lectures based on slides that the drug companies had prepared. This became a real issue with the psychotropic drugs for kids and the idea that a large population of kids had bipolar disease. This was a new disease that followed the development of supposedly better antipsychotic drugs, though it's unclear that they were better. The problem is, like we talked about before, this knowledge is knowledge with quotes around it. This knowledge is delivered by experts who haven't seen the data, to local medical leaders who haven't seen the data, to practicing physicians who haven't seen the data.
School teachers who haven't seen the data.
Exactly, who say drug this kid because the kid can't stay in a classroom and you got to do something. Well, the kid can't stay in a classroom and it's a real problem, but the answer may not be a pill.
And I'm glad you brought that up because most people don't acknowledge the environmental, nutrition, just nurture, spiritual aspect or religious if you want to get into that realm. But there are a lot of factors that goes into a person's mental health, and you taking a pill can't help that.
It may help it in some circumstances, but it can't fix it. It can't fix it. And what we've got is this sort of magical belief in medicines because there's such control of the information. This magical belief that a pill's going to fix this kid who can't sit in his chair and has trouble at home and there's all sorts of things going on in his life that make it impossible for him to learn the basic skills that he's going to need to be a successful adult. And to think that we can fix that with a pill is craziness. The story with the psychotropic drugs was there was a first generation of antipsychotic drugs. Thorazine was the first. It was back in the 50s. And that's when the insane asylums got largely emptied out, and you could put people on schizophrenics on drugs and they could live on the outside, supposedly, though many of them are homeless and in jail and living terrible lives. But that class of drugs had a side effect of creating muscle tremors and twitches and so forth. So and that was a known side effect. So there was a second generation antipsychotic drugs that were supposed to be better than the first generation. And they were supposed to be so much better that you could now give these drugs to kids and you can broaden the definition and lower the threshold for diagnosing bipolar disease in kids. And you could expand the indications for anxiety and social phobias and so forth. They weren't any better. It was a sham. They were no better than the older drugs. And the problem is not just that they charged a lot more for them, but it enormously broadened the market for these drugs that were supposedly safer than the older drugs, so you could prescribe them for more things than people who were hearing voices and getting violent. So this all argues back to the need. Science needs to be open. The breakthrough in science was in the 1660s, when the English physicists and chemists came up with science, the experimental method, and they formed the Royal Society of London. And they adopted the motto, nullius in verba. It's Latin, and it stands for take nobody's word for it. If you want to do science, take nobody's word for it. See the data, recreate the data, analyze the data independently before you accept something as valid science. Now that was 1660 in the beginning of the Enlightenment. We've now gone back behind those scientific standards. Our scientific standards are now lower than they were in the 1660s. Instead of the church telling us what we should believe and what science really shows, we have the investment markets telling us that. But we need some kind of reformation, like there was through the Enlightenment, to allow science to reclaim its rightful position. But that will only happen when the books are opened and people can recreate the science and recreate the statistical analysis. Before we get to that, we're going to have sham after sham, like the second generation antipsychotics are better than the first generation antipsychotics.
What are your thoughts about ADHD and ADHD medication?
Same issue. I've known kids that their brain won't allow them to be able to organize their life, to have the potential to grow up to be successful adults. It's a real thing, and it's a bad thing. And if you can treat those kids so that they can focus and function and be a normal kid and have normal friends and develop a sense of intrinsic worth, and if a pill will help the kid do that, and it couldn't otherwise be accomplished by changing the context that they're in, the family context, school context, community context, then it may be the right thing to do for some kids. But it's not the right thing to do for whatever percentage of kids we now have on these drugs. You got to change. Kids are just bundles of energy, and you got to figure out how to harness that energy so they can have fun and be energetically who they really are while they're achieving the goals of their education and forming citizenship and participating in social activities and religious activities and so forth. But if a kid can't do that, the window closes and they can be forever stuck as outsiders in society, not in a good way, not in a way that they're comfortable with. And so as a family doc, I would see that and I would refer those kids who looked like they were going to get locked out of a good life because they couldn't, because their executive function, they didn't have control of their executive function.